Hey, everybody watching at home, we're going about 2 minutes out. A good time, I guess, to remind people to please silence your phones and I would do the same.
Sounds like it's just like
How about you go ahead and sign that?
I
can always use the next. Okay, let's go ahead and begin. If everyone on Zoom can hear me okay. Want to welcome you all. This is the first of 2 speakers we're hosting at the Hayes Public Library. So many thanks to Samantha Gill and the HPL, as well as Dean David Macy of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for sponsoring Dr. Kohen tonight. Today, we want to just go ahead and welcome you all in attendance, those joining us via Zoom. As we begin this series talking to experts that will try to provide context to the current Israeli-Palestinian situation, why it has elicited such global discussion, and ways in which that discussion has unfortunately emboldened anti-Semitism online, especially in social media. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. As I said, please go ahead and silence your phones if you're joining us in attendance. For those here, we have slips of paper that you can go ahead and put your questions on. Just give me the high sign, I'll come around and pick them up. So at the end of Dr. Cohen's presentation, we can begin having a discussion based on your questions. Likewise, those of you who are on Zoom, please go ahead and submit your questions via chat. Dr. Nickel will go ahead and facilitate that question period. So I'd like to go ahead with that and introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Ari Kohen. He is a professor of political science, the Schlesinger Professor of Social Justice, and director of the Norman and Bernice Harris Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Dr. Kohen's books include 2014's Untangling Heroism, Classical Philosophy and the Concept of the Hero, and 2007's In Defense of Human Rights, a non-religious grounding in the pluralistic world. He is also the co-editor of the University of Nebraska Press's series, Contemporary Holocaust Studies, which focuses on contemporary research and teaching of the Holocaust. For FHSU affiliates, cheap plug for Forsyth Library, we have both texts available as ebooks. In addition, he is the author of so many articles published in so many journals. I won't even mention them all, but I do want to welcome you all again, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kohen.
Okay, I think it's turned over to me officially. It's nice to see everyone here in the Zoom room and all the people who didn't know maybe that they'd be on camera over there in the library. Thanks very much. Everyone who has cameras on, I really appreciate it. It makes the presentation a lot more engaging when I can actually see people that I'm talking to. I really appreciate the invitation to be here with you this evening. If you can't hear me in the back in the library, just raise your hand, wave at me, and I'll try to talk a little bit louder. One never really knows on Zoom with a hybrid format like this, if you can hear me well enough. I know the Zoom people can all hear me. just fine. So just keep me posted there in the library, and I'll do my best. I want to say a few things just by way of introduction or to get started, and then I'll say some of my prepared remarks. But especially, I want to reserve as much time as I possibly can to have questions from you, because I want to know what you're most interested in talking about, and then I'll do my best to respond to the topics that are motivating you to be here. So a few things to begin. I'm a political philosopher by training. That's my field of study. That's primarily the research and teaching that I do at the University of Nebraska. As Dr. Gribbin was saying earlier, my research these days is on the philosophy of human rights and the philosophy of heroic behavior. And those are really fun presentations that I don't get invited to give anymore. Instead, you get my least favorite presentation that I give all the time, which is anti-Semitism. So I apologize in advance for giving you my least favorite presentation. Nonetheless, I'm very, very honored to have been invited to give it. At any point in time, if you'd like to invite me to Kansas to talk about heroes, it's a way more fun, and I really love giving that presentation, and I would be delighted to do it. But of course, times being what they are, it is understandable that I'm often giving presentations about anti-Semitism. What I typically do, and what I won't really do tonight, is, unless you ask me about it, is rehearse the history of anti-Semitism, really going, all the way back a couple thousand years, and talking about the religious roots of anti-Semitism, really the way in which this form of hatred comes to be, and how, of course, it has endured. What I tell people all the time, of course, is that when we think about anti-Semitism and when we see it in the world, we're not seeing something new. We might be seeing a new iteration of it, a new version of it, but it's the same kind of classic ideas that come up again and again. And so once you learn to identify them, you can really start to see how they play out in the world around us. What I want to say by way of kind of prefacing my remarks about anti-Semitism in the post-October 7th environment is to say that, listen, I think we all recognize that there's a lot of different things I could talk about this evening with regard to Israel, Palestine, with regard to anti-Semitism, with regard to Islamophobia, the war in Gaza. All of these things are on the table if you would like to ask me about them. And of course, in the context of terrible fighting that's happening over there right now, it's a bit surreal in some ways to talk about the impact of that on people in, say, the United States. So I just want to begin by saying I recognize that. But nonetheless, I think it is an important topic, and it's something that we can talk about here in our own communities and the way in which people are being impacted by it. And so I think it is a really important topic nonetheless. The other thing that I just want to say by way of preface is, while I'm going to talk about anti-Semitism, there is, of course, just as there has been a spike in anti-Semitism these last months, there has also been a spike in anti-Muslim, anti-Arab hate incidents, and I think it's really important to recognize that and to understand that at the same time that we're seeing Jewish people being targeted, we're also seeing Muslims and Arabs being targeted, and that's I think something that, just as we want to tackle the topic of anti-Semitism, we should also be very, very mindful of the way in which not just the Jewish community but the Muslim community, the Arab community is also being negatively impacted. So really important things to say, maybe by way of introduction. The easy jumping off point in any discussion of anti-Semitism is, first of all, to say that historically, anti-Semitism arises as a specifically religious hatred. And it transitions at some point to being less about religious belief and wrong-headed religious belief, and more about the political impact that one can have when it comes to one's anti-Semitism. And so typically when I talk about the history of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incidents or beliefs, there is this important transition from religious to political anti-Semitism that we, I think, really when we look at anti-Semitic incidents today, and I'll kind of talk about some of the things that we see in just a moment, but these are not specifically incidents that are focused on wrong religious belief, right? So in the early days, it might be the case that people developed anti-Semitic hatreds, behaviors, because the Jews in the local community believed wrongly, right? They were stubborn in their refusal to acknowledge the divinity of Christ, yeah? And all sorts of conspiratorial thinking spun out from that initial religious commitment. Today, one doesn't have to have a strong religious position to identify Jews as a source of a problem, or to identify Jews as a target. And quite often what we see is that there's a political bent, there's a political message or political leaning that's driving those anti-Semitic thoughts, behaviors. And so a lot of the things that we'll talk about won't look on their face to be about the Jewish people as a religious group, right? But nonetheless, the group of Jewish people are being targeted, and they're connected, right? And the reason they're being targeted and their connection is a result of their being Jewish. Right? Now, there are political aims that are really the focus, in some sense, of that anti-Semitic belief or behavior. And I think you'll see this as we go through just a handful of things that we've seen over the last few months. The reason that I'm really focused on the last few months, of course, is that there's been a dramatic, I would say, shocking increase in anti-Semitic incidents since October 7th. It depends on where you are in the world. The figures are more shocking in some places, but they're pretty bad in the United States. And the last time that I looked at a measure of it, the figure was something like a 300% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States since October 7th. That was back in December. And as a result, this is something, of course, that people want to learn about and want to talk about and want to figure out. And one of the things that stands out, I think, is that so much of what we've seen we tend to see online, and there has really been a dramatic increase in anti-Semitic language and anti-Semitic taunting, targeting, bullying, and the virality of anti-Semitic messaging on social media sites. And in particular, if you spend much time on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, these are places where it feels like, in some sense, everybody is very engaged with this topic, the topic of Israel-Palestine, the war in Gaza, very engaged at this moment. It feels like for people who spend time on those social media sites, that's a lot of what the real world is focused on. But of course, all of those sites really represent a very small percentage of people in the world or people in the United States. The number of users might sound like a lot, but percentage-wise, it's quite small, and nonetheless, there's a seepage between the way in which the online world works and the real world, right? So Twitter, I tell my students all the time, Twitter is not the real world, but Twitter feeds into the real world. And it does it in a number of ways. First of all, if people spend a lot of time on there, they feel like that's the zeitgeist, right? That's what people are talking about. That's what's happening. And whether they see it in their communities or they don't see it in their communities, they're learning, right? They're getting a lot of information from these online sources. Some of it is useful information. Some of it is just wrong, right? Misinformation. There's lots of misinformation being spread on these sites all day, every day. And once you learn it, then you want to tell other people. And so it leaks out that way. The other way, of course, and we've known this for years now, is that journalists hang out on Twitter. And so if something is gaining a lot of traction online, they might write an article about it. And then it becomes a thing that exists in the real world, not just in the online space. And so then more people who don't spend time on social media will pick up on it. They see it on a website or in the newspaper, and off it goes. There are a lot of things that October 7th and the Hamas attack on southern Israel really kind of brought out. And I should admit first, and I say this all the time, I participated in this amazing 2-week seminar on anti-Semitism years ago, 2019 maybe, and I went there with lots of ideas and thoughts about the way in which white nationalists and right-wing media figures and politicians were kind of the politicians and the media figures were kind of dipping their toe into white nationalist, anti-Semitic language, messaging, conspiracy theories. And this was something that I thought, we all had a pretty decent sense of. And what I was told by organizers, what people really wanted to talk about was left-wing anti-Semitism, which I said, well, I'm not seeing that, right? The seminars took place in Britain, and they had all sorts of issues with the Labour Party at the time, and we had a very different set of politics here at the time in the United States. And so we were seeing two completely different things, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And what we've seen, of course, post October 7th, has been precisely what those people were trying to tell me about, right? That is, that in some spaces on the left, right, what we would call progressive circles in the United States, there is this tendency toward what I think we can very clearly label anti-Semitic thinking. And it arose in a very powerful way after that attack on Israel in October, in the beginning of October. One of the first things that came to light in the aftermath of that attack was everybody wanted to make statements, right? Whether you were a university administrator or a politician or the town council, everyone felt that they had to make some sort of statement. And there were some statements that attempted to say, this thing that happened was terrible. It's a very straightforward statement. Fine. There were some statements that said this thing was terrible and other things are also terrible. That's a different kind of statement. And then there was a third sort of statement. And that statement said, I don't condone any bad things that happen, but Israel had it coming. Right. And that was a fairly problematic statement. Right. And so the idea, the notion that there was a justification for the kind of what I would call, a pogrom, right? That this kind of attack could be justified by something else, right? That we could explain it, that we could say, we understand why people will massacre other people, is a problematic statement. I think that we have trouble thinking about other instances where the same kind of statement would be met with acceptance. I think if maybe some people will remember the feeling, the sentiment of the United States in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks. And the notion that people would say, right, that elected officials might say, well, this was terrible, but I guess we sort of had it coming, is not really one that I think people would have understood or felt comfortable with. This has become a kind of routinized thing when it comes to Israel. Right, and that's one of the things that I'll spend some time on and we can talk about. But it's this notion that there's a set of standards for most countries in the world, and then there's a standard for Israel. And this plays out in a number of different ways, right? On the one hand, my position would be that Israel should be held to the same standard as every other country in the world, criticized when it's wrong, applauded when it's right. People who want to work with the country should work with the country, and so, right? That's not how it actually plays out in the world. And this notion that there are two sets of standards is one that comes up quite often, right? When people talk about the problem of Israel and anti-Semitism. And what people are trying to get at is this idea of applying a different standard to this one country, right? And if we're doing that, why are we picking this country as the one that has a different or a higher standard, that receives a level of scrutiny that's a different level of scrutiny, as opposed to any other country in the world? I think that is one of those kinds of questions that people who study or are interested in the problem of anti-Semitism would ask, right? That there is something that is encouraging people to focus primarily on the one state that identifies as Jewish, and excluding or focusing in a much less rigorous way on other states, right? And so we saw this in those kinds of statements that came out, especially ones that said, we think everyone should have a nice life, and we see why this happened. The next kind of big example that comes immediately to mind, and I'm sure you witnessed this if you were paying attention to the news at all, was the incidents really across the global north of people tearing down posters of Israeli hostages who were being held by Hamas in Gaza. And this is one of those situations that is really hard, I think, for anybody to explain or to understand, right? So Jewish communities in lots of states across the U.S., in the UK, elsewhere, put up posters that were effectively designed to draw attention to the fact that a lot of people had been kidnapped and were still being, right? And in fact, over 100 people still are today, the end of February, being held by Hamas or perhaps others in Gaza. And the attempt to draw attention to the plight of the hostages infuriated a certain set of people. It drove them to a level of anger that caused them to go up to the posters and pull them down and get into shouting matches and get into shoving matches with people who wanted them to stay up. And this is one of these, again, situations where it's hard to really wrap one's head around the motivation for taking that action, right? I assume you've seen examples of this, but if I were, this would be the place where I would, if I was there, I would show you a video of a young woman tearing down posters of a baby, right, who had been kidnapped and who is being held in Gaza, and the level of rage, of indignation that is evidenced by the person because of the existence of the poster is a shocking thing, I think, to see. It's also a fascinating one because it's teaching us something, right? There are, I'm trying to be mindful of the time because I want to hear from you as well. So I'm going to just tick through a few more and then I'm going to turn it over to you for questions. There are, of course, if you're spending any time online, you're well aware, there are lots of conspiracy theories out there regarding October 7th, regarding Israel, and regarding Jewish people generally, right? For example, there's a conspiracy theory that actually it was Israel who was responsible for killing its own citizens, right? And that the Israeli military, right, this is one of those false flag conspiracy theories, that the Israeli military decided to do this horrible thing as a pretense, right? So then they could go and do what they wanted to do, which is kill all the Palestinian people, right? There is no fact in this. It is a conspiracy theory, but there are lots of these kinds of conspiracy theories. There's a conspiracy theory that suggests anytime the Israeli government or the Israeli military or any of its spokespeople put out a statement, they are lying, right? These people, right? The conspiracy theory goes, these people lie, right? And none of the things they say should be believed. The people who are not lying, however, that's Hamas. We can trust them and we can believe what they tell us, right? So when Hamas says, we didn't do this, some terrible thing, and the Israelis say, of course they did, and we have like GoPro video footage of them doing it, then the video footage is propaganda, but the people who perpetrated the crime have said they didn't do it, so we believe them. This goes to all manner of things, right? We saw some of this, play out in real time. Again, if you're paying attention online, you could really see how this sort of the environment of spaces like Twitter or Instagram encouraged this kind of thinking. The best example is a hospital that was supposedly attacked, bombed, and destroyed by the Israeli military. And it went so far, even the New York Times had a banner headline and sent a breaking news push notification to everybody's cell phones who subscribes to the New York Times to tell them that the hospital was destroyed. But the hospital is still there. The hospital was in fact not bombed, and the hospital was not destroyed. But then the New York Times revised their statement, their headline 2 different times. But each time they put the story out, they had a picture of a bombed out location, meant, of course, for us to think it was the hospital, but in fact, it was not. It was of a different location. When the Israelis said, we didn't bomb that hospital, they were liars. But in fact, even now, today, the hospital is there. These are the sorts of instances and examples where we're very quick, people were very quick to say, we know that these people are liars, and so they are lying. The last such example is one that's still very much in the news, and that is the question of sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th. And there's a whole host of people who their demand is that they should be shown proof, right? they need to, that the Israelis, in order to be believed, because they are well known as liars, they need to show some proof. They need to show physical evidence. They need to put on a show for the world, so that we can decide appropriately if we will believe the women in this case, right? And of course, there are lots of Jewish women who have, over the past couple of months, made a bit of a campaign about this, because so many of the people demanding proof of sexual violence in this case are the same people who, in the past, have been the believe all women group, right? So in this case, we don't believe, but in other cases, we will, right? And that's this question of why we're treating two things that are similar very differently. The last thing that I'll talk about, and then again, I don't want to go on too long. It's already been about a half an hour. And a half an hour listening to someone on Zoom is hard. But the last example is a very clear and very obvious one, and that is one in the real world, not online. And here is this question of where people want to hold their protests and demonstrations. And I think that this is the one that brings it home, I think, most easily and most obviously. If you have a problem with the Israeli government, and lots of people do, and there's nothing anti-Semitic about thinking the Israeli government is a bad government, or it has bad policies, or its politicians are terrible, or whatever, you can think that about Israel, just like you can think that about the United States, just like you can think that about Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or whatever you like. Perfectly fine. If you have a problem with the Israeli government and you decide to show that by protesting outside of a synagogue, you should be asking yourself a very, very serious question, which is, why did you choose that location? Right? What does a synagogue in the United States have to do with Benjamin Netanyahu? Because the answer is nothing. Right? That synagogue, the people who go to that synagogue, they don't vote in Israeli elections, and they don't have any say in Israeli policy. The only thing they are is Jewish. If you're protesting at a synagogue, if you're having a rally in front of a Jewish school, if you're threatening the Jewish community center in town, then I think we see that there's a problem. And this happens quite a lot, right? We're seeing people protesting outside of Holocaust memorial museums. We're seeing people having rallies. Pro-Palestine rallies. We have one here. I'm in Nebraska. We have one downtown on occasion, and that's a great rally. People get together and they support the Palestinian cause. They support a Palestinian state. It's terrific. It's not terrific if you do it across the street from a Jewish school. Right? Because that's a specific target, and it's chosen because it's the Jewish one. Right? And I think that those are the kinds of things that come up and that are most clear in terms of examples that we're seeing both online and in the real world. The very last thing I'll say, and hopefully there'll be lots of questions and people will have things that they'd like to talk about, and I'll do my best to answer as many as possible. But the other thing that we see, and maybe this is maybe this will spur more conversation, is this idea that I think is also inherently tied to a different way of thinking about Jewish people. It's this notion that the state of Israel simply is a mistake, shouldn't exist, shouldn't have existed, right? It's in this context, right? When one says, listen, there's no reason for a state of Israel, right? These people, the Jewish people don't belong there. They shouldn't be there. They should be removed from there. Whatever we want to say about it. This idea of the delegitimization of one place, right? Not other places, right? These are not people who are against states broadly, right? This is not an anti-state movement. This is simply a movement that says there shouldn't be a Jewish state, right? And when we take that position, when we delegitimize the very existence of the state of Israel, again, one might ask, what is it about this place in particular, right? And why is it that the focus is on this group of people? Everyone else, if you want to have a state, we can figure out how that works. But this group of people, they shouldn't have one, right? And this takes all sorts of forms, right? You hear people say that Israel is a settler colonialist enterprise, right? You hear people say the Jewish people should go back to where they're from, which is Europe, right? These are the kinds of sentiments that are expressed and that are designed, right, at their very core. They're designed to suggest the Jewish people are not from here, right? And anything that spins out from their being here, we can understand or we can justify, right? So if there is, a movement that takes the now famous phrase "from the river to the sea," and has that as their slogan, well, we can understand that and we can justify what they're calling for, which is the erasure of the Jewish people from this part of the world. That in itself, I think, is very problematic, right? And it leads to it's a very quick and easy way to make a political statement, but I think it's missing a lot of important information, a lot of context, a lot of background and history, and I think, again, most importantly, and this is where I'll leave it. In each one of these cases, right, and that we've seen, right, I think I've given you 5. In each one of these cases that we've seen over the last few months, nothing is being done to actually advance the cause that people who are saying these things or believing these things are attempting to promote, right? In no way are we getting ourselves closer to an independent, economically viable Palestinian state with any of these things. In no way are we moving closer to a situation where people in this place, right, because they all live there, that's where they're from, that's where they are. We're not getting closer to resolving this problem, which is a political problem, right? It's 2 people with competing claims. The problem has got to be resolved politically. And these sorts of claims, the double standards, delegitimizing the state, protesting outside of synagogues, none of it is moving us any closer. In fact, what it's doing is it's hardening people's positions, making it much more difficult to have a conversation, to have a dialogue, to attempt to reach any sort of conclusion that would benefit people on the ground. So before I find something else that I want to say or talk about, I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn it over to whomever is going to ask me questions and see what it is that you want to talk about. And hopefully we'll have as much of a dialogue as one can have via Zoom.
All right, can you hear me now, Ari?
Yeah, that's
Perfect.
good.
All right, so my name is Dr. Amber Nickel, and I'm actually a faculty member here at Fort Hays State University in the History Department. For the folks in this audience and this audience that don't know, and I will be moderating and kind of bringing together questions today. And the first one I want to kind of bring to you was actually introduced by one of our virtual attendees. And that question was, what role does propaganda play in contemporary political discussions about the Israeli-Palestinian situation? And how does this compare to some other historical cases in which propaganda has been used and abused in order to target certain populations?
That's a good question. The easy thing to say is that there's a lot of propaganda. And we're seeing, I think we're seeing some propaganda which is fairly sophisticated, and some propaganda that is not sophisticated at all. And I would say we're seeing attempts to convince people of things in ways that are I would say quite heavy-handed, right? So we have there's a list, for example, of what I would call white nationalists on Twitter who have verified accounts, who switched from posting the standard kind of right-wing white nationalist messaging. Post October 7th, they became progressive Palestinian activists, right? Because what they discovered was they could gather a new audience, right? So before they were posting about how it was unfortunate that Hitler was misunderstood. And now they're posting, it's unfortunate that Hitler didn't finish the job. And they have two different audiences who can both all of a sudden accept this kind of propagandizing. And these accounts are sharing all sorts of misinformation. They're sharing doctored videos. They're sharing, all sorts of stuff designed, of course, to outrage people and to get people to keep watching and keep clicking, because there's an economy online that the more people view your tweet, you actually, if you're a verified account and you have monetized yourself, you get paid. So it's an amazing system where people are able to take their anti-Semitic hatred and monetize it for themselves while also gaining an incredible audience. Having said that, we also are seeing, propaganda that's coming from directly from the Israeli military, and we're seeing propaganda that's coming directly from Hamas in Gaza, and there's a whole range, right? Some of it, again, not very sophisticated, and some of it, where they've spent time to really to try to sell a message and to get people to understand their perspective, their point of view. The trick here, of course, is that they're painting a picture that's designed to look a certain way. Right, and this is, that's at the heart of propaganda. That they're taking a message and they're attempting to spin it and to sell it. We've seen this historically. We've seen this, name a place, name a conflict, and certainly, there's lots of examples of this. We're in some ways, as unfun as it is to say this, we're being propagandized all the time, right? There's always a message with a kernel of truth, perhaps, but that certainly is heavily slanted or heavily biased to get buy-in, to get people to watch, to get people to agree, and to want the next thing. To go back to the other.
I'm managing two computers right now. Sorry about this.
Sorry.
I'm actually going to kind of try to combine a couple questions that we've got, because I think they go together rather well. One of the things that a lot of folks are struggling with is how to articulate a critique of the Israeli state's current policy towards the Palestinian population without crossing the line into anti-Semitic tropes. Can you kind of explain some ways that folks can articulate that in a way that is not anti-Semitic?
Yes. What a great question. Thank you. It's my favorite question. I'm aware that this is being recorded, but what are you going to do? I'll just use myself as an example. I have been personally a critic of Benjamin Netanyahu for almost 30 years. I think that in terms of the goals of the state of Israel, he's toxic. In terms of making things better for the Jewish people and for the Arab minority in Israel and for the Druze and for all of the citizens of the state. He and especially his current coalition now are probably the worst possible collection of politicians that you could have. If it was my choice, which it's not, they would all have resigned in disgrace, certainly on October 8th, but even better would have been as soon as their government was formed. I think that I'm not on an island with that position. In fact, hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets every single week for almost a year in protest of this government and its policies. So I just said all of that. None of that would be characterized, I think, by anybody as anti-Semitic. With regard to the specific policies impacting the Palestinian people, what I can say, again, and I don't think there's any problem with anybody saying this. I don't get away with saying it because my name is Ari Kohen, right? I think anybody can say this. The policies impacting the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza are terrible for the Palestinian people, also bad for Israel. The best solution here is a set of policies that make life better for people, not ones that make life worse. If you want to resolve a conflict, the Israeli government under Netanyahu has done the opposite time and time again. Right? Their policy, especially now, and let's look just at the West Bank. The policies in the West Bank of expanding the presence of the settlements, the policies of empowering, arming the settlers, are some of the worst policies that I've seen in recent memory. They are the opposite of what you want to do if you want to make life better, even just for your own citizens, right? If you're not, let's say you're not interested at all in the people who you're impacting in the West Bank, the Palestinian people, your own citizens. You would make life better for them. You would have a more secure and a more stable state of Israel if you didn't do the things you've been doing. Now, all of that is pure policy critique. It has nothing to do with the Jewish character of the state. It has there's no, like, I was going to show again, if I should have gotten this slide ready to show you. I apologize that I didn't. There's a political cartoon of Netanyahu, and he's building a wall, right? And he's got the trowel and he's laying bricks. And the bricks, and there's blood dripping, right? The mortar is blood, and it's filled with the faces of people that he's murdered. You don't have to do that, and they've caricaturized Netanyahu. They've given him a big nose, right? Much bigger than the way he looks, so that you know that he's Jewish. We don't need to do that to criticize the policies that his administration, right, has undertaken over the years. We can very specifically criticize the policies. And similarly, we don't have to go overboard in our criticism. We can be measured. And then we're much less likely to run into the kind of territory where someone will accuse us of saying something anti-Semitic. So as an example, the policies are terrible. Right? The policies are resultant in, and sometimes intended to, produce violence. And this is horrific. We can say all of these things. We can say that the checkpoints are humiliating, and we can say that the way in which people are being treated is inhumane. We cross a line, in my opinion. We cross a line when we say these Israeli Jews are Nazis, right? Or some people say they learned from the Nazis. or they're worse than the Nazis. We can express our outrage with a policy we think is bad and that should stop without shading into this territory that I think takes us over the edge.
We have two questions that are concerning kind of reception of Netanyahu and kind of the conflation of the state with Jews in Israel. So I kind of want to combine those two. So the first one is, how is increasing news that Jews inside of Israel, as well as Arab Israelis inside of Israel, are increasingly dissatisfied with the Netanyahu government impacting anti-Semitism kind of internationally? And then to follow up on that, how is Netanyahu's own rhetoric, in which he says that the state of Israel speaks for all Jews, also impacting this?
Yeah. So there are different. I read a lot of Israeli journalists because this is my job and I need to know these things. And so I read what they're writing, and there are some of the Israeli media. Segments of the Israeli media have been picking on Netanyahu for years, right? Especially as his rhetoric about speaking for the Jewish people all over the world has really ramped up. There are journalists who refer to Netanyahu as the king of the Jews, and they're sarcastically, because one of the things that I think is so important is that there is no one who speaks for the Jewish people. Right? This is just, there's no council of Jewish elders who make decisions for world Jewry. It simply doesn't exist. If if you ask Jewish people, they'll tell you if you put 5 Jewish people in a room, you'll have 6 opinions. All of these, the idea that there is one voice and it wants whatever the Likud government is saying it wants. That's very nice for the Likud. But I think it's simply not fact, and you can see it, especially on the ground in Israel, right? In Israeli politics, the political landscape in Israel is very different from ours. It's a parliamentary system. It relies on coalitions to build governments. You don't vote for politicians; you vote for parties. It's very different, and so this notion that there's lots of people who disagree with the current government, that's absolutely correct. Israel is in some, prior to October 7th, politically, Israel was at one of its, most divided moments, right? They very recently had 5 elections in 4 years. And the whole question of the last 3 of those elections, which happened back to back to back, was Bibi or not, right? Can we have Netanyahu or can we not? He's a very polarizing figure in Israeli politics. In no small part because he's also under indictment for corruption, and part of what's keeping him, from potentially at this point potentially going to prison is being prime minister. So this idea that he speaks for the Jewish people is mistaken. He doesn't even speak for a big portion of the people in Israel. The electorate over time was voting less and less for the Likud. The problem was that the Israeli left is very, very fractured. And in the most recent election, Netanyahu he has had to put together increasingly right-wing coalitions in order to maintain his government. And in the most recent election that resulted in this government, several political parties on the left failed to reach an agreement prior to a power-sharing agreement prior to the election. And as a result, a lot of people who might have voted for some of those parties did not. The margins in these elections are very, very narrow, with very high voter turnout. So how are people around the world thinking about this? I don't know if they are. If I'm being to be perfectly honest with you, the explosion in interest about Israel since October 7th has been stunning, right? It's the most important issue if you ask people, right? For especially people who consider themselves to be progressive activists, right? The most important issue. But I'll give you just an anecdote. You can do with it what you want. I teach every year at the University of Nebraska a class. It's called Israel in the Middle East. And it's about Israeli politics and the Arab-Israeli conflict. And it's an upper-level political science course, and every year it's full. And full, I teach, these are upper-level classes, so it's 35 students. Every year it's full. I taught it this past semester. So in the middle of the semester, the war started. But people had to sign up for the class last spring. This semester, when I taught it, right, last fall, I had 14 students. It's the lowest enrollment ever. Because Israel wasn't front of mind for anybody. People were not, even though there were protests in the streets every single week. Every Saturday night, hundreds of thousands of people were gathering to protest the government. But I mean, at least judging by the students that I teach, there was very little interest. Now, I should say, while she's moving from one computer to the other, that I then got a call from a reporter for the student newspaper at the end of the semester who discovered that I was not teaching the class this semester. Because as anyone knows, I would never teach the same class twice. Back-to-back semesters. But she said, is there something going on at the university? Do they not want you to teach the class? Everyone wants to take this class. I said, well, it doesn't work that way. We planned our schedule like 3 years ago, right? And I teach it in the fall, not in the spring.
So for this last question, I'm going to try to combine about 8 different questions that I got. My skills are unparalleled here. But I do know that we don't want to take your whole evening up. So really the crux of this question that's going to get rather wordy because I have to include lots of things is there a solution, right? That's really kind of what everybody is looking for. And folks have asked questions relating to a solution that, is there a solution that does not involve ethnic cleansing? Is there a multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-confessional solution? Is there a 2-state solution, a single state solution? All of these things are things that you have heard before, of course. And so what can we do, if anything, to kind of open dialogue about these types of solutions? And based in your very informed opinion, what is the best solution that we have available to us right now?
Yeah. Well, that's a great 8 questions, and really nicely digested into one multi-part question. It's the $1 million question. If I knew the answer to what should we do, I would probably be the next ambassador, and we would have the next Abraham Accords, and then they'd give me the Nobel Prize, and that would be wonderful. If you have suggestions, please tell me, because Nobel Prize has always been at the top of my list. But the first thing is people are being killed now. Right? There is a horrible, unacceptable situation that we are in the midst of. And that's the first thing that has to be resolved. And there's no question about it. We're not going to talk about 1 state, 2 state, any of that in the middle of a war. And what's happening right now is an absolute catastrophe. And I don't think we can mince words about that. And we don't have to call it, we don't have to use any other word except to say it's atrocious and it has to end. The idea, right, what people have hit on in the United States especially, but elsewhere in the world also, is this notion that we're just going to call for a ceasefire and that's going to magically resolve this problem. And I unfortunately am here to tell you, no, it won't. A ceasefire does not solve this problem. It doesn't even solve it in the short term. It certainly doesn't solve it in the long term. And the reason I say this is first of all, you need two sides to have a ceasefire, right? There has to be an agreement that will hold up in order to have a ceasefire. What people are actually calling for today is for Israel to stop fighting and Hamas to do whatever they want. And I think it's important that we just recognize that. There's nothing gained by pretending that both sides here would equally agree to stop fighting and that it would be meaningful. And the reason I say this is because the Hamas politicians have gone on television and they have said very straightforwardly, we're not going to stop fighting. Our goal is to do this over and over again. Right? This kind of attack was an amazing thing, and we'll do it again as soon as we can. That's not you can't have a groundwork for a ceasefire with that in mind. At the same time, it's important to say the continuation of the war is actually serving Hamas, and it's serving Netanyahu. And I think it's important to recognize that as well. If all of the hostages had been released during the previous announced pause in fighting, right? If you remember a couple months ago, there was a pause of several days. Some hostages were released. If all of the hostages had been released, it would have been very hard for Israel as a democratic country to continue to pursue its war aims, which are nebulous, right? We know this from our own history. A war on terror, a war on a terrorist organization has no, you can't defeat terrorists by bombing them. It doesn't work, right? You create more people who are immiserated and who turn to the terrorists and their ideas. The idea that you could continue the war when all of the hostages had come home, very, very hard to accomplish. But Hamas doesn't want to return the hostages, right? Because they're gaining, right? Even at the terrible cost to the people of Gaza, this is benefiting Hamas, and they've said as much, right? They'll accept any cost in civilian lives. It makes Israel look terrible, which is good for them, and it encourages more people to come to them, right? It's also the extension of the war means an extension of Netanyahu's time in power. The Israeli feeling over the last several months is that he cannot survive politically what happened on October 7th, because Netanyahu's whole message to the Israeli people for decades is that he will keep them safe. And he didn't, right? There is no political survival for him in the long term, but he's suggested that you can't change governments in the middle of a war. So this, the resolution of the conflict as it exists is necessary, but it's very, very difficult to accomplish because both parties who are participating, right, not the civilians on either side, but both parties who are participating are benefiting, unfortunately. If Hamas releases the hostages, right, they're still working on this, right? The last thing that I saw was that negotiations are still ongoing. And if those are successful, I think that will allow us to then move into those conversations about a day after. And that's really the spirit of your question. So I guess I should have gotten there a little bit faster, but I don't want to ignore what's actually happening in Gaza. So what happens the day after? It's anybody's guess, really. It's anybody's guess. From my perspective, the idea of two states was one that had fallen out of favor for a lot of people, especially because for Israel there didn't seem to be any motivation to move forward. And to be perfectly honest, for the Palestinians, there is not a dynamic leadership that is at the moment trusted and capable And when I say trusted, I mean actually by the Palestinian civilians themselves. They they look at the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas as being corrupt and ineffectual. But he, now in his 80s, has worked really hard to make sure that he doesn't have a successor, right? Because then they might try to get him out sooner, right? Sooner than the end of his life, or hastening the end of his life. But there has been a lot of revitalized talk lately about a two-state solution to this problem. And I think there would be a lot of support for it internationally. And when we think about two states, they have to be viable and secure states. They have to be, you can't have a state that is, first world, high-tech startup nation next to a state that's impoverished and with no capacity, no airport, no farmland, right? Nothing that would allow for real economic viability. A state that would allow people to feel that they have, a real potential for a future, and that's what has to happen ultimately, right? If you want, if we're talking about, defeating a terrorist mindset, the way that you do that is you make people's lives better, so that it doesn't seem like their only option is to launch rockets at city centers, or blow oneself up at a bus stop. Right? People who do that are doing that because they have no other options. There is no future in their mind. There is no way for things to improve. And so, it seems to me, at least, that really, pursuing a just and lasting peace necessitates real opportunity, a real option for a solid future where one could have a home and have a family and have a job, all of these things that are central to human life. And if we are focused on that, I think we can start to think about how to accomplish that politically. Right? What are the incentives that could be offered? What are the ways we can push, for example? As an ally of Israel, what are the ways in which our government can push for a real advancement in these kinds of dialogues? Because what we've learned, I think, is that the status quo that we had on October 6th was, it was a mirage, right? It seemed like Israel could continue doing whatever it liked to do, and the Palestinian people were an afterthought, right? We had all of these, we had the Abraham Accords, we had normalization between Israel and a number of Arab states, which nobody thought was possible. We had, right in the immediate time preceding the attacks, we had the possibility, which I think is still very much on the table, of normalized relationships between Israel and Saudi Arabia, all of which left the Palestinian question to the side. People pretended as if that was something that could happen, but I think it's crucial that we recognize that if we want to have a stable, secure country for Israelis, right? And that's the Jewish Israelis and the Muslims and the Christians and, right, all of the people who live there. If we want security and stability for them, we have to want the same thing for their neighbors.
So I think beautifully stated, and a great place to kind of end today. I did have quite a few questions that didn't get answered. Would you mind if I forward or put them together and kind of forward them to you and try to get answers back to folks?
Sure.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come out and chat with us today, at least virtually. And then I'm going to make a few announcements, but you can hang out or you can go, whichever makes you happy.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for your great questions.
All right, so for those of you that came, we'll be having a second event next month where Dr. Jonathan Scarion will become talking with us about the historical kind of precedent for conflict between Israel and Palestine. He's a specialist in Jewish experiences in the Arab world, mostly in the Ottoman Empire, as well as Arab experiences. So I do encourage you to join us for that as well. Thank you all for coming out today. And if you are in my class and did not sign an extra credit sheet, please do so now.